All right, so this is a bit of an interesting ways that news on both fronts for both Game of Thrones and Star Wars has sort of come together. Now, I think people sort of know the basic story, so let me just go through the quick context and how they're interestingly interlinked. So, Last Jedi comes out and is very divisive among some fans, but it's critically praised, makes a ton of money, and Rian had announced this before, but Lucasfilm had committed to make a trilogy of his films. But The Last Jedi's reception sort of puts that into doubt, and so far there's been no official announcement. But now, most recently, and I'm going to be citing LRM as well as Star Wars only, we have sort of a more solid basis for expecting the trilogy to come out. And interesting enough, it actually has a lot to do with Benioff and Weiss. Now, with Benioff and Weiss, as we all know, they did Game of Thrones as producers and writers. And to put it mildly, even though season 8 did please at least some of the fans and it did make money, they got world, breaking ratings. They had really solid, 10 million plus people tuning in, which is not small. And at least the early part of the season was very critically praised. It did, I think, overwhelmingly get a huge amount of critical backlash, and most fans are displeased with how they ended the story. And just as soon as they finished Game of Thrones, they were announced to be doing a Star Wars trilogy. And so it's interesting that in retrospect, because Benioff and Weiss later went away from the project, right? They're now on Netflix. But both HBO and Benioff and Weiss made it seem that there was really no connection, that the ways that season 8 impacted everyone really had no effect on Lucasfilms in terms of them deciding to stay with or lose Benioff and Weiss, and that the negotiations broke down over money, etc., 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 and they wanted to go to Netflix anyway. And apparently this is not true. That as much as Lucasfilm was concerned that Last Jedi was sort of divided in terms of its reception, Knives Out by Rian Johnson was a huge hit. It was a huge hit in the US, it was a huge hit in China, and that persuaded them that whatever else, Last Jedi made money, Knives Out made money, and that Rian overall had very little trouble with his production of the Star Wars films, whereas all Star Wars films besides Last Jedi have had huge production issues. So when they weighed in the balance, it just didn't add up. Like, why were they going to keep Benioff and Weiss, who had this very problematic season 8, and they were not going to do the trilogy with Rian? So, in retrospect, there are really interesting couple lessons, but two of them are really relevant for both fandoms. One is that the fandom did matter. As much as the HBO denied that season 8 and its outcome really affected them, they've decided not to go through with one series. And in terms of Benioff and Weiss, the reason that Lucasfilm apparently did not do the trilogy is that they were thinking about season 8 and how not only they how it was done, but also their reaction to it, which is they basically tried to ignore the fans, didn't do really any interviews, really tried to do this kind of controlled response to it, and have sort of tried to stay out of the public light. But again, they were looking at the numbers, and apparently they can see for themselves that people are not buying season 8. It's got a huge backlash and everything like that, and comparatively, Rian is a much, much safer bet. So it's interesting that the two seem not linked together, and only that was speculation before, but apparently they did come in together. And Star Wars only says that his own sources tell him that, yeah, Knives Out box office did really persuade them that Rian was a much better choice to do a trilogy. Now, he was not going to do the trilogy right away, and there's still no official announcement. Taika Waititi is expected to do his Star Wars film by 2024, and more likely than not, it'll be produced by Kevin Feige, and that'll come first. But that, yeah, it is in all probability going to be a trilogy that's going to come out. Whether it comes out theatrical or whether it's going to become on D+, it's unclear. Again, as far as we know, he's going to be writing and directing both. Right now, he's doing the Knives Out sequel script and going to work on that first. But yeah, season 8 really had this massive impact, not just on Benioff and Weiss, but Lucasfilm as a whole in terms of where they're going to go forward. So despite what people say that the season 8 backlash really had no real impact, it actually did have a lot of impact on how HBO and Lucasfilm are going to do some future projects. But I think a second lesson is also kind of interesting in terms of auteur filmmaking, and sort of its limits as well as its virtues within the studio system, because I think the major issue for Disney is not even so much what it is that Rian wants to do, but the price range. And Bob Iger, even though he's going to retire soon, really wants to control the budgets. So it'll be an interesting question whether if Kathleen Kennedy stays on, she's going to be able to authorize these kind of much bigger budgets that Rian and some of the other directors want, or whether they're going to do a much more contained cost approach like Blumhouse and just give people a lot of creative freedom, but only with a little bit of money. So it'll be very interesting going ahead whether Rian will be able to command the budget he did with Last Jedi. All right, that does it for this very intriguing interlinking of the Gurmverse and Star Wars universe. If you like the content, please hit the like button and/or subscribe. Thank you for listening. Please be safe.